This is Troy Devolld, and you're watching the TV Writer Podcast.
Hosted by Gray Jones, the TV Writer Podcast is brought to you by Script Magazine and ScriptMag.com, the leading source for script writing information in print and on the web. My name is Gray Jones, and I want to welcome you to the TV Writer Podcast. Well, today we're entering the world of reality TV with reality TV writer-producer and author of Reality TV, An Insider's Guide to Television's Hottest Market, Troy Devolld. I'm sure you're going to love the interview. We talk all about reality TV, the landscape, what it means to write, how to break in, why you would want to break in, all that type of stuff. A bit about Troy Devolld. Troy Devolld is a writer and producer in the reality television genre. He's the author of Reality TV, An Insider's Guide to TV's Hottest Market. Now, you may know that I actually do work in reality TV myself. After reading this book, I can say he is spot on everything that you need to know about reality TV. So if you have a great idea for a show, or if you're just interested in working in this massive part of the industry, I urge you to buy this book and read it, and you're going to find out more about that in the interview. Currently, Troy Devolld is co-executive producer on VH1's Basketball Wives. He began his career with MTV's Fear and The Osbournes. You may have heard of these shows, and has gone on to write and or produce major reality hits, Dancing with the Stars, The Surreal Life, Flipping Out, Black Gold, and more. In 2009, he was jointly nominated for a Daytime Emmy for his work on Style Network's Split Ends. He is a graduate of Full Sail University and a member of the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, the Caucus for Producers, Writers, and Directors, and the WGA West's Nonfiction Writers Caucus. Troy is represented by Beth Bone of Bone Management, and you can find him at his website, realitytvbook.com. And also on Twitter, though he says he's not on there very much, at Reality TV Troy. I'm sure if you follow him and start to ask questions, it's going to interest him in being on there more. But right now is my interview with Troy Devolld. Here we go. This is Gray, and I'm here with co-executive producer of VH1's Basketball Wives and author of Reality TV, An Insider's Guide to Television's Hottest Market, Troy Devolld. How you doing, Troy?
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thanks. And I really, really appreciate you coming on, and for a number of reasons. I mean, I, of course, work in reality TV, and so when I read your book, I just thought it was spot on. Everything that I go through as an editor, I saw from your end, and I know because of all the story editors and producers that I've worked with, you covered all the bases in that book. And I'm really, really happy because there's not a lot of books for reality TV and an introduction for a really, really monstrous part of the industry. So I can't wait to pick your brain. And also because I work in the industry, I might know some of these things, but I'm sure our viewers don't. So really, really cool. And what we typically do in our interviews is we'll start with your path into the industry and then move on to later stuff. But I think with this one, just because we haven't covered reality TV a lot, I think we need to take a little section at the beginning and talk about what you talk about in the beginning of your book, which is the landscape, first of all, and why somebody would want to work in reality TV. And particularly the audience to this podcast is probably people who are primarily either want to enter the industry or are in the beginnings of entering the industry. So keeping that in mind.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you that before I got into reality television, I wanted to be a screenwriter. Specifically, I had my eye set on television. And when I went to move to Los Angeles in the year 2000, I had already done a lot of local television production in Florida, and thought, well, I'll just get out there and stump it as hard as I can, and somebody will hire me to write sitcoms, Right.
The dream.
Because, they're just waiting for you to show up. It's just, they're just with bated breath. Thank heaven there's finally a writer that came to California. But what ended up happening was I was halfway across the country. I pulled into a motel in Texas that was the scariest place you've ever seen in your life. It was one of those places where they hand you the key to the room through a mail slot. And I was watching a show that night called Fear on MTV. It was a paranormal reality show. That was a special. And the only person whose name I knew in Los Angeles crawled by in the credits. And I said, well, there's a phone call I got to make in the morning. So I gave this gentleman a call, and he was nice enough to say that, well, the show is actually kind of coming together. It's in the process of going to series. I thought it was just apparently a special, the first episode. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, there might be something we can do. So I came out and I started as a logger transcriber, which I'd never heard of before, which was just transcribing transcribing tape for the benefit of the story department so that they wouldn't have to watch all the source material. And from there, I just sort of fell into reality television. I really enjoyed the process, and it was something different. It was much easier to find work there because people weren't interested in it yet. It didn't seem as sexy as writing movies or sitcoms, so there were fewer people trying to kick the door in. So, and it's much the same today. There's not a lot of people that get up in the morning and say, like, as soon as I get out of film school, I'm going straight to, straight to Bad Girls 5. I can't wait to jump in there.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute.
Sure.
I mean, first of all, we have to dispel the myth. We have to correct the myth that reality TV isn't written, despite what unions may say. But tell me a little bit about what is written. What could somebody expect to write, and what would their role be in relation to the stories?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you that there is a lot of writing that's done in reality television. It's not always as direct as putting words in someone's mouth, but I will tell you that there are several shows that are very heavily driven by narration. You have home improvement shows. You have a lot of things that fall into that genre where there's nothing but. I think Anthony Bourdain's No Reservations is a great example of how narration drives the show, and the work that Anthony does in writing his own material is outstanding. It's beautifully done. In addition to that, you have many of the same processes that you do in any other form of writing. Shows are outlined sometimes before shooting, where you have a series of events that you are, stringing together. Like, well, we'll go from showing the house to showing them consult about what needs to be done. There's a whole thing I call the home improvement exercise, because if you look at a home improvement show, you can see how they're set up and they're formatted, and you follow very specific things. Scenes are set up like, we have to do this before we can do this, before we can do this. So there's a lot of outlining. You can either do it before, or if you're doing a documentary series or docu-soap, those shows, you have to take your source material and then create outlines based on what you've already got in the can. There's a lot of writing also. I call it spackling. It's my own term, where you are trying to connect scenes where scene A and scene B don't make any sense joined together. But if you put a bite over it that says, after we rode horses, I thought might be a nice idea for us to have dinner and do something a little more quiet. Well, then all of a sudden, riding horses and going to dinner kind of seems like they're supposed to be together. So it's a lot of the little patchy work. It's different from screenwriting in a lot of respects, but as far as having to be able to tell a story that has an arc, both by episode and by season, those are writing skills.
Well, and also something I guess would be important is in some ways and on some shows, the process is actually quite similar to a documentary. You mentioned being a logger transcriber, and so what a logger will do is you'll have pages and pages and pages of transcripts of interviews, and what happens often with the documentaries, you just go over the transcripts with a highlighter, pick the best stuff, and then you do a paper edit, combine those bits together, and whoop, almost there you have a story. That's part of it. But then what else can a story editor or producer in reality do that shapes the story?
Well, I find that more now than ever before, they use editing software. I mean, my teams on shows that I've worked on recently will actually go into the source material, and as story producers and writers, not as editors, we'll create, we're in the old days, we used to just take a paper cut and we'd pass it along to an assistant editor to string out for the editors. We'll cut those things ourselves and be able to pass those along. So it's getting to the point now where you've got to have, you've got to be able to cut on Final Cut Pro or Avid in order to be a writer. It's kind of an unusual skill set to be required for something like that. It does make the job a lot easier. I think that you're able to pass something along that's a lot closer to what your vision is. Because with paper edits, it's one of those things where you're guessing that because you've seen these 10 things that they'll work together. Sometimes they don't. And you know that as an editor when you get something that worked in here, but once it gets out, it's a mess. So it's a lot more interesting now that story producers are able to cut their own stuff, their own string outs before they go over.
And you mentioned that there's a number of different times that you might enter the process. You might start in pre-production, you might start in production, or you might start in post.
Right.
So what we've been talking about a little bit right now is basically what might happen if you started in post.
Right.
But when you start in pre-production, tell me about a bit about what the role of a writer might be at that point, and also about production.
Well, in the occasions when I've been able to start in pre-production, it's nice because you can say, here's an idea for, if you're going to do an episode about this, this, or this, you can beat out an outline and suggest things to your team in the field. If the field is working on their own, and sometimes you're that guy who's working in the field alone, there are story people who work both in post and in the field, then you're really kind of shaping story on the front. And it's great when that happens. But I think what ends up going on is a lot of the time when production companies don't have a ton of money, they'll hire a crew and have a field story producer who may or may not be super experienced, who's gathering things off of a checklist, and hoping that it's just that sort of shoot it all and we'll sort it out when it gets back. In which case you're usually overshooting your material by a long shot and just sort of hoping that everything will come together in post. There are times when a story producer will come on in the post process, and all we do is sort out what's come back from. I realize it's a bit of a redundant statement, but it's just there is no set way that any reality show is done. Many of them are put together differently. It's one of the things that was hardest with the book is when someone says, yeah, we'd love to publish your book on reality television. And you start to explain the process and you realize, well, wait a minute. I just realized that the process is there's 38, 40, 50, 60, 1,000 times, there's that many ways that you could put a show together. But you can really come along at any point in the process. And I think that that's kind of an alien concept to a lot of writers who are interested in reality television.
Yeah. Well, and actually, I think from the perspective of a writer who might be still on the fence of which one to work on, there are a lot of opportunities in reality TV that are just you'd never do in scripted stuff. I mean, for one thing, the very fact that you could actually be in the field shaping the story as it goes.
Yes.
It's practically being a director in some ways, in the way people might understand a narrative director, in the sense that, the story's not going as you would like, and to say, why don't we do this now? And
right.
To a writer who's always been cooped up in a writer's room, that's some pretty exciting stuff.
Right. And in the writer's room, you're less likely to have drinks thrown at you, which is another, you're missing everything.
Yeah. But so tell me a bit about maybe those more active ways of shaping the story. And also actually in some ways with the pre-production that might be completely foreign to somebody who doesn't know about the process to think, well, how can you plan out what's going to happen if it's reality? Right.
Well, there are certain types of things that happen in the field that it's like being on another planet if you're a writer who's just getting started in reality television. If something were to happen, if there's an enormous argument that comes out of nowhere that has nothing to do with your scene, and you had no idea that these things were bubbling up within your participants, you've got to think pretty quickly, well, do I have enough that the scene can accomplish what it needs to when we set out? If we're going to introduce a new topic, which is always good, scenes always have to introduce new information. Every fight starts somewhere, and if something comes out of nowhere, you've got to figure out a way to explain that thing that came out of nowhere. So immediately your mind is reeling, and you're thinking, well, tomorrow I'm going to sit these two women down and have them talk about what it was that happened at dinner. And then in the moment, as the dinner's happening where they just argued, I should pull them off to the side and have them kind of explain something or cool down or make sure that I get that person storming out. And the brain just starts going about all this source material that you really think you should have. And you have to really think cinematically, because you can't just end a scene anywhere. You've got to have, I laugh all the time that, on reality shows where I have a newer or less experienced staff, there are things that people don't think about that you absolutely have to have. You have to have walk-ups. You have to have exits. You have to have all of these things happen. Otherwise, you go to a scene and you've got the outside of a restaurant and then people are already seated inside talking. You don't have any intro to the scene. Nothing is getting set up. You really have to be able to spitball and figure out ways to make those things that are actually happening in real life make sense, which sounds ridiculous, but you have to make real life make sense.
Well, and actually that, again, is another thing that would be really exciting for somebody in scripted television. In scripted television, you might work for years in it before you ever are able to sit in an edit bay and be involved in that part of shaping the process. But for a reality TV story producer, you're there working with the editor as part of your process. Tell me about that.
Right. Well, in working with the editors, there are certain ways to do that. I'm a little less hands-on than a lot of producers are, because my editing team, a lot of the people that I work with, come from film and other things where they've done traditional and scripted material, and they're familiar with the needs of story. I have right now one of my favorite editors on my staff cut Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo. I was beside myself. It was a childhood, it's like, I remember that. But at any rate, you hire people who have that kind of knowledge that you can turn them loose. Some story producers, I think they hold the reins too tight, and a good editor will let you know where you've gone wrong or the pieces that you've missed. And a lot of it is about, when you get things together and you have conversations with an editor in an edit bay, you realize what you've missed. You're able to go to the field and say, I really could use a scene where these three go into a restaurant and talk about this particular thing so that it doesn't come out of the clear blue sky. What's missing. And working with editors, a lot of people that work on my shows say, we don't understand who's in charge. Is it the story producer? Is it the editor? What's the flow chart like? Well, if it's up to me, everybody's on a level playing field. I think anybody at any point in the process can make a suggestion that's going to turn the whole thing around. So if you're in there, if you're one of those people, editors don't want you behind them all day, eating your lunch and texting while they're trying to work. I mean, it's a solitary pursuit. It's best done with the door closed and no one else around. But when it comes time for those conversations, you both of you have to be receptive.
Yeah. And there's a lot you can do in editing. In some shows, actually, you can go out and actually reshoot stuff, and depending on where the production's at, you might have that flexibility. But let's move on, perhaps a little bit more to what kind of how might the lifestyle slash and we got to get a little bit into how much you can make in this. We hear about people in scripted television, after 3, 4, 5 years making $250,000, $500,000 a year. So what kind of lifestyle slash pay might they expect to get in reality?
Well, I'll tell you, reality television, if you were going to come in as a most people make their way in either as a story PA or a story assistant. Once you get that break, I would say that probably pays anywhere from $650 to $800 a week US. From there, you'll move into a full story producer position. The lowest paying story producer position that I've been aware of late is $1,200 a week. It's the lowest amount of money I've heard anybody offered. And you can make anywhere from $1,200 a week up to $2,300, $2,400 a week. From there, you can move into a supervising story position. Those will pay anywhere from $2,000 to maybe at the outside $3,000, $3,500. I've gone up the ladder from there, and I'm basically, I have a lot of producer duties now in addition to what I'm doing, so you can make more than that later on. The thing too to remember is you hear about those numbers and you think, well, that doesn't really compare to television. Well, television is largely seasonal. Scripted television is. With reality television, you have the ability to work 52 weeks a year if you want to. Most of the work that I've done in the last 3 or 4 years, I haven't really been off work since January of 2010. That it's like a regular job. I get up, I put on my pants, I go to work, I come home, I go to bed. That's it. 5 days a week. I very seldom work a Saturday or a Sunday unless it absolutely has to happen. And I think if you work efficiently, it doesn't necessarily have to. And you can work, you take those numbers and suddenly, reality TV, yeah, you're working year round to get that money, but you are making, it's not inconceivable to make $100,000 a year within the first 3 or 4 years of doing what it is you're doing. Yeah. If you can move up the ladder to a full story position.
Yeah. Which in a lot of industries, that would just be impossible.
Yeah.
And so we've established that there are a lot of attractive parts of it for a writer and why you might want to break in.
Sure.
Let's talk a little bit about how easy it is to break in. You mentioned entering in at the logger transcriber level.
Yes.
So is that a tough job to get?
Logger transcriber positions are not necessarily difficult to get. Obviously, you have to have fantastic typing skills and, the ability to focus for long periods of time on stuff that source material will bore you to tears.
Uh-huh.
If you're willing to jump in there and do that, those jobs aren't necessarily that hard to get. But I will tell you that over the years, production companies, I think, are farming out a lot of their logging and transcription. So you aren't seeing loggers and transcribers inside the company as often. In which case, I would tell you that it might not be a bad idea to look into a PA position or story PA position so that at least you're there with the people who are putting the shows together.
Right.
That's what helped me. Is I started out as a logger transcriber, but it worked for me because I was physically in the room with the story people, so that when they came in, I could make a suggestion and say, "Hey, I'm noticing this is happening across a lot of the tapes. You guys might want to look into this, or I'm seeing a through line here," and talk to the story department. Get involved with them. Don't just do your job and go home. They used to laugh at me because I would come in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon for a 7 p.m. shift. And they said, "Why do you do that?" I said, "If I don't, I have no FaceTime with you and the EPs."
Yeah.
You've got to make yourself known. It's different. It's different than writing. It's not that you're just on staff. You're having to make the most of the time that you're there, by networking with the people and demonstrating that you do have a knowledge of story and that you can move forward.
Mm-hmm. And I know from my end, it doesn't matter who it is when we're looking for that pineapple. If somebody knows where that is, they're a very valuable person.
Yes.
And so I can imagine as a logger transcriber, if you actually pay attention and can be that guy who knows, "Oh, I know where that is. I know where that is," I'm sure it would help a lot.
Exactly. Or the guy who's willing to stay in the office for 36 hours to figure out where the one shot of the guy feeding his fish is. That was my claim to fame early in my career. It was like, they couldn't believe I stayed for a day and a half to find this material that they just knew was there, but they didn't have it in the logs.
Yeah. Oh, so, I know. I worked in a show that one particular episode had 87 hours of footage, and all of the tape logs, they were shooting in a swamp,
right.
All of the tape logs were lost.
Oh.
So I literally had to go through all of this 87 hours of footage.
Right. Oh, man.
Myself to find everything. And it wasn't the kind of stuff you could transcribe because it was all like just people going through the swamp and stuff like that.
Oh, geez. That probably took a little while.
Yeah. Yeah.
I empathize.
In that part of the industry, we can say that it is reality TV. Stuff happens.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Luckily,
substitute your own S word there.
Yeah. Yeah. So and luckily that's an extreme example, and most shows are run a lot better than that. I did this. It was a great show to work on, but that was just an accident that happened.
Sure.
Just like I know in features, there's the time that the reel is lost, and everybody in the whole city knows it. Within hours. Well,
I think it's one of those things too that when you're working in reality television, you have to realize that hindsight is 20/20.
Mm-hmm.
That there are things that happen in the field that when you're pursuing action and you're doing your best to keep up, and you don't have a shot of someone saying a key thing for the scene because you just happen to be on other reaction shots in the scene, or maybe one of your camera guys is in the process of repositioning, and you just want to yell, and you're like, I can't believe no one was covering that. Well, they didn't know it was going to happen.
Yeah.
And it's not always like you can stop down and say, could you please say this thing again? In the heat of the moment, people say, amazing things that just cannot be repeated or duplicated.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're not actors as much as there's actually some people you'd think, wow, they sure could be. They're great on camera and they speak well. And then there's others not so much, but and that part of it, again, that is reality too. I mean, as much as we're shaping, we're putting them into situations at times where we're prodding to say, could you bring this up or whatever, but it's their words that are coming out, which is, that's pretty exciting.
I agree.
Yeah. So why don't we, now that we've sort of talked about the lay of the land and all that, now let's go back and talk a bit about your path through. Okay. So you mentioned that you were on your way, you saw this show as you were on your way to Los Angeles, and you looked this guy up and you got on as a logger transcriber. So from that point, what was your path in?
From there, on the same show, actually, I made all the way to story producer over the course of about 6 months. It was an interesting pursuit because I proved myself valuable as a logger transcriber, and the people that ran that company, I was lucky enough to get in on the ground floor, and I'll tell you, it was Chris Abrego and Rick Tejas. Mm-hmm. And Chris Abrego, you may know, is the guy who created all those VH1 shows and owns half of a company called 51 Minds. Mm-hmm. That they went on to be hugely successful with all their spinoff stuff. But this was his first show solo. Wow. As a producer. They kept me around. And I didn't have a ton of money when I moved to Los Angeles, but and they knew that. So I would be a PA one week, I'd be assisting location people the next week, and I just really got sort of that immersive experience where I really understood the process. It was like going to school, on their dime, because it was just that they didn't want to let me go until they, had more story for me to do. So if you look at the credits for Beyond Fear, I started as a logger transcriber on that show, and then all of a sudden I'm an assistant story editor, and then I'm a story editor, and then, that just worked out from there. It stuck. From there I went over to the Osbournes, was the second show I worked on. Mm-hmm. What you talk about being lucky is you have a show that, I think the Osbournes actually, just to get a little off track for a second, the Osbournes was an interesting scenario because if you look at the people who were the story producers on that show, most of them come from very heavy scripted backgrounds. Mm. You had writers for SNL and Sex and the City and Carolyn in the City, and these are the people who were just, putting this show together. And that was when it first occurred to me that just like, well, you know what? This is a two-way thing. Writers can come across to reality television and use the skills that they've got. I mean, these people like Henriette Mantel and Sue Kalinsky and, it's just an absolutely amazing group of people with credits, as long as your arm, electing to work in reality television.
Well, and that's an interesting thing, and I've seen a lot of people like that who have written in the scripted world and made a decision to come over to reality, both in writing and actually in editing. I've seen it too, and I know in your book you mentioned somebody who had worked on Star Wars, I think you said, and came over to reality.
Exactly.
So obviously there's a lot of attractive stuff here. And actually one thing that you touched on a little bit, which I think is interesting, is that it does happen in scripted television, but not as much, that you develop relationships within a certain company that produces a lot of shows, and they'll just keep you around, and it becomes a family of people working on a whole bunch of different projects. Maybe talk a bit about that difference there.
It really is interesting. Well, writers will often, if I was on a writing staff of a sitcom and I moved to another sitcom, of course I'm going to try and bring people with me who did a great job before. Mm-hmm. But in reality television, the way that these companies are set up is if you develop a good relationship with a company, you can stay there for years. The company that I work for right now is called Shed Media. Mm-hmm. The folks at Shed, there are people there that I know have been there 5 and 6 years. There are editors who work so consistently that they've decorated their bays. If a guy gets to pick out his own paint color and couches and lamps and everything else, he's going to be around for a while. Yeah. But it's one of those things where you find a home and the execs like you and they understand that you can execute. you can work pretty consistently at a company that has a lot of product going. If you work someplace that has 5 or 10 shows on the air at a time, you can shuttle back and forth. You know, there are a lot of times where you'll get a phone call that says, hey, so-and-so is between shows for about 6 weeks. How would you like to have a third person just for a few weeks? Because we don't want to let them, you know, sit at home and not get paid. There's a lot of companies that give you the opportunity to really become sort of family, and the pressure comes off because in reality television, you know, I talk about how you can work year round, but that's 13 to 20 weeks at a time. And in the early days, you were always scrambling to find a job the last 2 weeks you were somewhere because there's never any real notice. Yeah. Everything in reality is, hey, you know, can you come in on Friday and talk with us a little bit about something? You show up on Friday and like, we're doing a new show that starts Monday. It's never, it starts a week from now or 2 weeks from now. It's always, it starts Monday. So we're going to hire you the Friday before. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Well, and you know, that is incredibly exciting because I know one of the most terrifying things for people who want to break in, and you know, you're in Topeka, LA might as well be China. Like it's scary. And it's scary to think that it's not just China, but it's China where there's a bazillion people all fighting for the same jobs. Right. And that's scary too. But to think that there's this environment where when you break in and there's a lot going on, a lot of work, and when you break in, you might actually have a steady paycheck for a long time.
Right. Well, also, if, you know, certain production companies are the only game in town, but if you're in Denver, there's always High Noon. If you're in Orlando, there's a company called Pink Sneakers. There are smaller reality production houses all over the place. There's an amazing amount of stuff that's going on in oddball spots like Maryland. You know, it's just like it's easier to find those first positions in recognizable shows. I have a friend of mine that came out here looking for work that had a credit on a show in Orlando, or that had shot in Florida for a company called Pink Sneakers. But because it was a show that had run on a national network, it's a useful resume entry. Usually I tell people, if you've done a lot of regional television and you come to Los Angeles, you might as well erase your resume and start over, because if it's not relevant to that city or been carried on a network where it's been viewed by people in that city, it's almost like it didn't happen. You know, if you've done work for your local television affiliate station for years and years and years on local programming, it's sort of like they'll look at that and say, all right, and what have you done that any of us have seen? But again, if you can find those smaller companies that have a national reputation, you may not even necessarily have to take the plunge and move to Los Angeles or New York. If you could figure out a way in the door and a way to stay there. Yeah.
Well, and that's very, very valuable stuff. So you were moving up the ranks. You worked at a couple of great companies. What are some lessons that you've learned along the way that might be helpful to the viewers?
Well, there's a lot of things. I think that one of the things that I'm kind of known for among people that I work with, I call it a celebrity allergy. Is I love the people who are on my shows, but I don't like to hang out with them. I don't like to get super familiar, because what ends up happening is my career has shifted. I did a lot of work in the field early in my career, in the first several years. And it was one of those things where I just felt more comfortable in post, because I felt like when you see a person off camera, you develop an impression of them and you say, well, this person is really great, or this person is a real jerk, or whatever your image is. And suddenly you're seeing all of the source material through that filter. And you're trying to make the person on camera the person that they are off camera. And what happens is there are a lot of people, and it happens to many people, where they start self-producing because they're really worried about how they're going to look on camera. So suddenly their speech patterns change, or suddenly they're more concerned about something than they would be normally. And they're smaller internal tics. And if you have an existing impression of that person and the footage is living up to it, you start to feel like you're never really getting to who that person is. In post, all I have to do is make sure that person is the person that they seem to be in the material that's coming back. And I think that just, especially a docuseries, docusoap, I feel like I'm doing a much better job by not getting familiar with them. You don't see pictures of me with cast members. it's one of those things. It's not that I don't like them or enjoy them. I just find that in order to do the shows, you kind of have to maintain that little bit of distance so that you can really count on the footage to tell you the story, as opposed to, your own preconceived ideas.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's now take a new shift in direction and talk about pitching shows. Now, first of all, I have to establish, and especially working in the industry, that the very first thing is people would have to buy this book, read it cover to cover, and do all the exercises.
Yes, and then work for 5 years.
And then work for 5 years, exactly. Like there's a lot to the process that just has to be learned in the trenches.
Yes,
but and I know, and I'm sure there's so many people who say, I just saw this reality TV show, and I have a great idea for a reality TV show. So let's talk about if somebody just does have this amazing idea, and they buy the book and they read the book, what should they do? Or maybe not just one great idea, but they really think that that's their forte, ideas for shows.
Well, I'll respond to that here, but I'll also tell you, just as a resource, on my website, realitytvbook.com, I talk about that a lot. I call it the $1 million napkin. That everybody thinks, I just got this great idea for a reality show, and you're just going to go in and just it's about 4 guys that live in a junkyard, but they actually, they do a tea service at 4:00 every afternoon for people. Anything that ends with bam, like the old Hollywood, what do you think? Yeah. That's not a show because it's a concept, but you don't have a cast. You don't have anything else. You're not bringing anything to the table. Nobody wants to hear that. You'll never get in to pitch it at the network level unless you have huge celebrities attached. If you're lucky enough that, Beyonce is your cousin and has enough free time that she wants to do a reality show for you, a little easier to get a meeting there. But for most people, it's very, very difficult. I will never say that anything is impossible. I encourage people who are interested in creating reality shows to get into the industry and to work there for a little while to understand the workings, because there are a lot of traps that you could fall into in trying to create a reality show. You create a reality competition show, you've really got to think about what your elimination metrics are, the whole mechanics of gameplay, all this other stuff. You have to write a very detailed treatment in order for people to be interested in talking to you about it. Yeah. There's less and less development money to go around, and you've got to have your idea really, fleshed out, and it's got to make sense. Anytime, again, I come back to the celebrity attachment thing, usually it's a great thing. It's a little easier now in certain things because we have a lot of these shows that are about occupations. That's kind of the new wave right now is, people who have unusual businesses, if a guy that just does nothing but you have shows about exterminators, you have shows about, we've always had shows about ghost hunters. I keep thinking of terrible jobs. Anything where you have a group of people in a workplace environment that are kind of funny and screwy, like Cake Boss or any of those shows. Those are of interest, but you really have to know who those people are. And that's where you have to think about the sizzle reels, which we'll get into, I'm sure, later in the conversation. But, producing just something that's, 3 to 5 minutes that gives you an idea of who those people are, what you can expect from the show, the types of situations where people run up against conflict. That's also a common mistake when people create a reality show is they'll say, well, I know this person who's very interesting. And you say, well, what are they really up against? Well, nothing. They're just interesting people. Well, if there's no conflict, there's no show. Yeah. It's not about people punching each other in the face on the boardwalk. I always say it's about, it's about me worrying if I'm going to lose my house, or worried if I'm going to, this is going to be the one dangerous job that I don't come back from. The whole premise of Deadliest Catch. There's got to be conflict built in. And people, again, who are new to creating reality shows, they get that one sentence idea and forget that there's an awful lot that you've got to chase it with to make it a viable show.
Well, and so we will get to the sizzle reels. But actually, yeah, let's talk a little bit about that right now. Okay. So a sizzle reel is, as you've got this great idea, and say you've read your book and know a lot about the processes, and you think you've figured out how to structure the show and what the gameplay is going to be like, etc. So what is your goal from a sizzle reel?
The goal from a sizzle reel is you want to establish your talent. You want to establish the conflict. You want to be able to illustrate that the show is dynamic and engaging. You want people to believe that it's an idea that will carry for an extended period of time as opposed to just being an hour-long documentary about somebody. Mm-hmm. And those are really the things that you mostly need to hit. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean you have to spend a fortune putting these together. I was up until 2:00 last night editing a sizzle reel for something that I shot as a one-man band with a camera and a mic, and my talent over the course of 2 weekends. Total expenditure, whatever my gas was to get to where she was, and the camera kit that I've owned for 4 years. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to spend a ton of money on it, but it's got to look decent and just really identify who people are, what their conflicts are, and just that the show is worth watching. Mm-hmm. That's the whole thing. It's got to look like a viable show.
Yeah. Well, and let's take that a little bit further then. And I know that there's been a lot of dabbling in this. There's a number of people who have said, actually, I just interviewed Bill Rabkin, who wrote Writing the Pilot. And also I know I talked to Rob Thomas, who did Party Down and Veronica Mars. And They're both advocates of shooting your own pilot.
Yes.
And by extension, things like, because it's so easy to shoot something up and get it up on YouTube and put up your own site.
Right.
What avenues are there for people who want to take this route and actually start to produce something themselves and either use that to say, look at the potential of this, like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia,
right,
or that kind of thing?
Well, I hear a lot. As far as web content, there are a lot of people that are producing webisodes. Obviously, I wouldn't produce a 30-minute pilot and then throw it up on YouTube hoping that somebody would see it. Mm-hmm. That's a tremendous amount of effort, and I'm not really sure that anybody is really trolling YouTube looking for the next big thing. Mm-hmm. I say that, and then, of course, tomorrow someone's going to sell another, stuff my dad says, sell a show based on a Twitter feed where I've been knocking my brains out doing these elaborate things to try to sell. Yeah. I don't really know what's next because there are avenues that I will tell you have worked. There are things that I tell you, are standard where people do things. As far as producing your own pilot, it's pretty brassy. And I think that the reason that you hear about people who have produced their own pilots is because it's such an uncommon thing that when it does pull off, it sounds like these are geniuses who believed in their own idea enough to sink that kind of money into it. Mm-hmm. But for every success story, you probably have hundreds of people who, went to all of this effort and just didn't pull it off. Often because in reality television, I think that the game plan, in order to try to make something interesting, a lot of people will force conflict or there will be imaginary conflict. Mm-hmm. There was a summit recently. They call it Real Screen. It just ended in DC. Mm-hmm. And there are a couple of things that they said on the panel that they were talking about people who pitch shows, that the one thing that executives hate to see is fake or forced conflict for the sake of the reality, for the sake of the sizzle reel. Mm. Prolong that into trying to keep something on rails in a reality pitch. Uh-huh. And then the other thing that I think the only other thing that came out of it was that they were all sick of hearing Coldplay in people's sizzle reels. They're like, if you're going to use music, don't use Coldplay because for some strange reason everybody's using their music. Yeah. I think there's a lot of room for error. Scripted, you can be really clever. You can really keep things going. Reality TV, to try to produce your own pilot by yourself, to rein in your cast, to try to get things to look convincing. It's really difficult. Hmm. So I wouldn't suggest it. I would say stick with a sizzle reel. Just my 2 cents. Yeah. And then if you do it differently and sell a show, please write me a taunting email, and I will be happy to send you back the frowning emoticon of sadness when I realize that I've been wrong.
Yeah. Well, and I guess that is where I can't think of any precedents, unlike this stuff my dad says for Twitter and that kind of thing. And I know there's a lot of people who have reality-based web series. I think of one podcast viewer has one called The Chocolate Tourist, where there's a host that goes to all sorts of different places to find out different ways that they make and produce chocolate and stuff. And who knows? Maybe one time there might be a show like that all of a sudden hits and gets so successful that somebody says, I want to put that on TV. We haven't seen that yet, but that's not to say that it couldn't happen.
Exactly. And I'll never tell you that something can't happen. I can only tell you the ways that it has worked for hundreds of people before us.
Yeah.
A lot of people get discouraged if I say, well, you're probably not going to meet with an network executive. It's probably not going to. I tell people when you pitch a reality show, you're going to have to talk to a production company and partner with somebody who's got more muscle than you to go out. Well, what if I want to do it my way and it's this way? I think that, television is the wrong place for most auteurs. I really think that they should stick to film. And I don't say that in a way where I'm putting people down. I'm just saying that it's just one of those things where television, the sooner you realize that it's a collaborative medium, the better off you are.
Yeah.
And by collaborative, I mean there are people in suits that you never see their faces who have a lot to say about what you're doing. So it's very, you can change the world, but it's easier to do it the way that evolution might have theoretically, and just go from a lungfish to just that thing that crawls, as opposed to being a lungfish that goes, I can't wait to be able to run in the Olympics. There's steps in the middle.
Yeah. Well, and I know we've been talking about your book, and we've talked a lot about reality a lot, but also you have speaking engagements like what's come. Well, from when we're taping it, what's coming up. We're going to release the podcast after it. But tell me about some of the stuff you do with teaching and public things that people can register for.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you, there's a couple of things. You just missed it in February. I'm speaking from the past into the future. You've just missed the TV Writers Summit, February 12th, 2012. Where Jen Grisanti and Chad Gurvich and Nancy Sadler and I are all doing 2 days of instruction for people who are interested in getting into television writing. I also, I do other appearances as they come up. I've done some stuff at the Writer's Store in the past. I may go back and do more. There are certain things. If you're an educator, a lot of people don't know that the book actually has a course syllabus, so that if you wanted to teach it as a semester-long thing, you could do that. But I will be speaking on a panel this coming August, I think it is, at the University Film and Video Association annual convention in August, which will be in Chicago. So if you're an educator, I'll be up there. If you want me to come anywhere, come to a bookstore, do whatever, drop me an email. And if it's something that's feasible, I might be able to do that. So there's stuff coming up, but I don't have a lot on the books right now. Well, I'm kind of making a TV show right now, so it's a little tough to get away.
Yeah. Well, and you do blog at your website, realitytvbook.com.
Correct.
And there's a number of helpful articles there as well that expand upon the things that you touch in the book and go further to your own experiences. You have a Twitter address, Reality TV Troy.
Reality TV Troy, and I'm almost never on Twitter. I've really got to get better about that.
Yeah.
So I'll get out there. Yeah. I'll say it right here on the podcast. I'll get back out there. Cool.
Well, I'm sure if lots of people follow you and start asking you questions, I'm sure that'll give you an incentive. So
sure. And the book has a Facebook page as well, so you can find it there.
Cool.
A little more active on Facebook.
Yeah. So I think we're going to start to wrap things up here. Is there anything else that you think we missed or that you'd like to mention?
Well, I think that just in mentioning it, as a writer coming into it, I don't think that I would have ever looked at reality television as a viable alternative to writing for sitcoms or dramas. I think that if you don't, you're cutting out a tremendous amount of opportunity for yourself. There's a chance to do good work. I think that reality television is often discounted as a less than, or that it's just swimming in bad ideas. There's poorly executed stuff on both sides of the fence, and absolutely beautiful shows as well. You've got shows running right now, like An Idiot Abroad, I think is one of the greatest things I've ever seen. I mean, it's such an amazing show. The Anthony Bourdain shows. There's a lot of good stuff out there, and it's reality television. It's reality television. The label, you want to slap the nonfiction label on it so it sounds fancier, that's fine. But there's a lot of good work to be done out there. I think it's still finding itself. And I think that would be a great place to be as a writer in a genre that, even though it's been around since 1948, is still, trying to figure out what it wants to be when it grows up. So check it out, get in there. There's money to be made. It's consistent work. There's good people, and you get to learn a lot more. Your skill set is very broad compared to what I think a lot of writers who are confined to scripted have done. Mm-hmm. And great people jump the fence all the time. Yeah. I've worked with people on reality shows now. They're working on 30 Rock and working on Saturday Night Live and all these other things. Story is story, and story is written, and just it's worth looking into.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, that is a great place to end up, and I really, really appreciate you taking the time. I know you are a very busy man in this industry, right. and so best of luck to you, and hopefully I'll be able to meet you sometime.
Very good.
Yeah, I hope
pick a coffee shop in the middle.
Cool.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah, cool. Great. Well, thanks so much, Troy.
You got it. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye. Hosted by Gray Jones, the TV Writer Podcast is brought to you by Script Magazine and ScriptMag.com, the leading source for script writing information in print and on the web.